Mainstream media reported finding mass graves in Canada. Not just any graves, though. Indigenous children's graves. It caused a national outcry. The only problem was, it wasn't true. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. When it comes to public trust, the mainstream media aren't doing so hot. Most Americans trust the mainstream media with information about as much as they trust Ghislaine Maxwell with babysitting. We can probably all think of a few reasons why. Well, here's another one. Almost exactly a year ago, the New York Times ran a story titled "Horrible History: Mass Grave of Indigenous Children Reported in Canada." Wait, a mass grave filled with Indigenous kids? Of course it led to a huge outcry. That was shortly followed by media reports of other mass graves that were supposedly uncovered around the same time. The only problem? The media got it wrong. Really wrong. But that's an honest mistake. I mean, who hasn't been working long hours on the job, got a little careless, and accidentally led millions of people to falsely believe that mass graves were popping up in more places than Starbucks? Happens to the best of us. Did I mention that these stories also led to violent protests and church burnings across Canada? Yeah, it was bad. Here's what happened. It all began with an Indigenous residential school in British Columbia called Kamloops.
An investigation at a former boarding school for Indigenous children in Canada may have revealed a mass grave. Preliminary findings suggest the remains of 215 children could be buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School.
Now, when you think of mass graves, you probably think of the Holocaust or the Bucha massacre in Ukraine. Probably not Canadian schools. The only mass graves you should find in Canada should be discarded Tim Hortons coffee cups on car floors. As Justin Trudeau put it, we think about a distant country where genocide has happened. This is not a distant country. The thing is, it's not really what happened either. The New York Times set the tone for the story's coverage by calling it a mass grave of Indigenous children. Who wouldn't click on this? Other mainstream media followed shortly with similar headlines. Although I guess it's better that the New York Times set the tone for this story instead of BuzzFeed. I don't want every news source asking me to take a quiz to figure out which Canadian mass grave I should be for Halloween. But the story just kept getting bigger from there.
Another disturbing find at a former residential school site, this time in Saskatchewan. It's the second major find since the discovery of 215 unmarked graves at a residential school in Kamloops, BC. The 751 graves found represents the largest number discovered at a residential school in Canada.
Once again, the New York Times was right there on top of it. Yep, the New York Times and mass graves go together like peanut butter and unspeakable crimes against humanity. But when the New York Times called the original story a mass grave, it was wrong. But it never admitted it. And that's just one piece of how this became the biggest fake news story in Canada. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. Last year, a story blew up in mainstream media about the discovery of child graves near an Indigenous school in Canada, which made readers gasp, and it made the clickbait fair yell, "Ka-ching!" That story was followed by other reports of unmarked graves being discovered near other Indian residential schools. While these stories had details that were true, the stories, and especially the headlines, were not. The truth was a lot less sensational than the headlines. For example, there were no mass graves. This was something that was pointed out by several Indigenous chiefs shortly after the New York Times story broke.
This is not a mass grave, but rather unmarked burial sites that are, to our knowledge, also undocumented.
As of yesterday, we have hit 751 unmarked graves. This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves.
What? These aren't mass graves? But if people stop believing that, then the clickbait fairy will stop showering money on the mainstream media. Keep believing, everyone. Click! Click faster! Another problem with these stories? Some of these graves were not just discovered like the media claimed.
Chief Cadmus Delorme says it's not a mass grave. At one point, there were individual markers at the burial sites, but Catholic Church officials removed them in the 1960s.
That's right. Remember the 751 unmarked graves discovered near an Indian residential school in Saskatchewan? They weren't just discovered. A former student at the school told CBC News that we've always known these were there. The news here is that Chief Delorme wanted to find out where each grave was so they could be marked again. So they weren't just discovered, they weren't mass graves, and get this, they weren't necessarily Indigenous children buried there either. Chief Delorme told CBC this is a Roman Catholic grave site. It's not a residential school grave site. Other Roman Catholic faithgoers, Indigenous and not, adults as well, have been buried there. Yeah, I know we're supposed to listen to Indigenous voices and all, but do we have to when they're killing our story? So yeah, about every aspect of this story that makes it sound horrific, mass graves of Indigenous children, just doesn't pan out when you look a little closer. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the atrocities at these Indian residential schools. What happened there was pretty bad. Let's just say these schools weren't the kind of place you'd want to send your children.
Barry Kennedy remembers being an altar boy at the Maryvale Indian Residential School and burying a deceased child. He says school officials inflicted sexual violence upon students, and one of his classmates disappeared in the night.
You heard the begging for help, right? No one would ever go and help. Everybody was always too scared. And Brian was one of those individuals, and just he never returned.
Both Canada and the U.S. used the schools to assimilate people.
For more than a century, Indigenous children across Canada and the U.S. were forced to attend residential boarding schools, funded by the government and primarily run by churches. In Canada, lawmakers were explicit about their goals to, quote, get rid of the Indian problem. Children were cut off from their families and traditions. They were also punished for speaking their native languages.
Yikes. I know. That story isn't nearly scandalous enough. Thank goodness they added in all that made-up stuff to make it seem really bad. In 2008, the Canadian government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. One of its goals was to investigate and record the harm done by the Indian residential school system. It concluded the schools had committed cultural genocide. And its successor commission, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, estimated about 4,100 children died or ran away from these schools. So yeah, it was bad. For years, there were rumors of children awakened at night to dig graves for their classmates. British Columbia's former representative for children said students at the school said, "I dug a grave here." This is part of the reason Chief Roseanne Casimir hired specialists to use ground-penetrating radar to look for the bodies of missing Indigenous children. Remember the 215 supposed child graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia? The story that kicked this whole thing off? That figure came from this ground-penetrating radar survey. However, the radar can only detect what might be graves. It's more like a "you should look here" tool than a "look what we found" tool. The anthropologist hired to do the survey later called them probable burials and revised the number from 215 to 200. She also said the only way to know for sure how many and who was buried there would be to excavate. A year later, Casimir hasn't released the survey to the public like she promised. And none of the graves have been excavated either, which means the number of graves or who was in them can't be independently verified. Well, this story was starting to stand on some pretty shaky ground. That didn't stop it from becoming a bombshell in Canada. And that had disastrous consequences. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. Media reports last year about mass graves belonging to Indigenous children in Canada haven't exactly lived up to the headlines. But that hasn't stopped the narrative from spreading like wildfire. After this New York Times report came out, Canada's Crown Indigenous Relations Minister compared it to the death of George Floyd. And it did have a similar impact. Some called for a national reckoning. Historical statues were toppled to protest the mistreatment of Indigenous children. At least 68 churches were vandalized or burned. The Canadian government initially pledged 27 million Canadian dollars to help communities locate and identify those lost. Later, it promised another 320 million Canadian dollars for Indigenous communities facing the fallout of the residential school system. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ordered national flags flown at half-mast, and a vigil for the children was held before a Stanley Cup playoff game. Trudeau went even further. He released a statement about his heartbreak at the discovery of Indigenous children buried at these residential schools. And he was photographed kneeling with a teddy bear at an unmarked grave. You would assume one of these unmarked graves at a residential school, right? Wrong. Trudeau was kneeling at a Catholic cemetery, a cemetery where both Indigenous and non-Indigenous children and adults were buried. It was the same cemetery in Saskatchewan that I mentioned earlier, where the Indigenous people were trying to tell everyone that this wasn't an unmarked residential school cemetery, but no one was listening to them. So did Trudeau know he wasn't kneeling at a residential school cemetery? Was this just a cynical publicity stunt? If it was, it really worked. The news about the graves had international reach as well. The Pope apologized on behalf of the Catholic Church, and the U.S. Department of the Interior pledged to look for graves in the U.S. as well. And China sent an edible arrangement because if anyone doesn't take human rights abuses lightly, it's China. Just kidding, China used the chaos to its advantage as usual. It demanded that the UN open a human rights investigation into Canada. And I'm sure it was just a coincidence that right before this happened, Canada was about to ask the UN to investigate Uyghur genocide in China. Total coincidence. Perhaps the biggest fallout, though, was how polarized the issue became. Academic discussion dried up, and anyone who questioned the narrative was labeled a residential school denier. A journalist who recently wrote about this issue said it had become such a lightning rod, you were either a believer or a heretic. There was no in between. Sound familiar? Only now, a year later, are some journalists and academics beginning to question the media's narrative, which simply wasn't allowed before. Not like now, where you're free to question everything, such as, I guess that's why people are losing confidence in mainstream media. What really gets me, though, is that this whole time, Indigenous leaders have been trying to set the record straight on these graves. But for the most part, the media just ignored them. And even a year later, the media still isn't admitting any mistakes. This New York Times headline still says mass grave. So if public trust in the media is low, that's why. It's not because the media got it wrong and admitted their collective mistakes. It's because the media got it wrong and pretended they didn't. And they refused to listen to people who were telling them they were wrong. So what do you think of this story? Let us know in the comments below. And just so you know, this show would not be possible without support from viewers like you. If you want us to keep debunking fake news, head on over to our Patreon page or join our exclusive social media community on Locals. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.